My name is James Warren, and I am Professor of Ancient Philosophy in the university, and I'm also a Fellow of Corpus Christi College, where I supervise students in philosophy and in classics. So while I specialize in Greek and Roman philosophy, I also teach some other areas of philosophy, particularly early on in the philosophy tripos. I've got, I think, 45 minutes or so to talk to you this afternoon, and I'm hoping not to take up all 45 of those minutes, so that there might be some room for Q&A as we go along. So I'll keep that box open, and I'll make sure I glance at it in case you want to shout out if I'm making no sense whatsoever, or you have a devastating objection halfway through. What I want to do today is start off with what I think might be some relatively, I'm not going to say dull, but relatively straightforward claims about truth. And then what I want to do is show you three puzzles that arise from those. I think they're attractive puzzles, in part because all of them have their roots in the kind of history of philosophy that I do. So all of them have their roots in ancient Greek philosophical thinking. And I think it says something about the way in which the Greeks approached philosophy that I think is really attractive and really fun and really interesting. And what I mean by that is I think they often approach philosophy simply delighting in the difficulties and the puzzles and the problems and the paradoxes. So the notion of a kind of paradox, something that might emerge that's weird or absurd or fascinating, starting with some very, very straightforward kinds of thoughts. Okay, so enough preamble. Let's see where we get to. So what I want to start with is just a very, very boring kind of claim. It sounds a bit fancy in this way, but I hope just give me 5 minutes and I'll try and explain what I mean by it. So the claim I've got in mind is this one. Every proposition is either true or false. Right, question one, what's a proposition? Because that seems to be something we ought to understand if we're to understand the idea that every one of those is either true or false. Well, roughly speaking, and you know, that there are various kind of fiddly kind of bits of technical stuff that you might get worried about, but broadly speaking, for our purposes, a proposition is the content of an assertion. So when I say something, when I assert something, so asserting rather than asking a question or giving an order, but when I assert something, I say that something is the case, or I say that something is not the case. It's the content of that assertion. That's what a proposition is. So here are some examples, and I've just thrown them all together because I think they show you a range of different things that count as propositions. So one of them is, it is not raining. That's a negative assertion. One, I had Weetabix for breakfast. That's a positive assertion, but it's in the past. It's about the past, sorry. 1 trillion is a big number. That's not saying it's now a big number, but it might not have been otherwise. It's just a general kind of truth. And then a statement where the proposition has the future tense. Cambridge United will win the league this year. Unlikely, but you never know. Just to kind of draw attention to one kind of notion of a proposition that I think is important is just to get you to recognize that the proposition in this case isn't, as it were, just the words that I'm using, it's the content of the proposition. And one way to make you understand that is just to point out that it is raining and il pleut in French are one and the same proposition. Right, it's different words, different languages, but they're the same proposition. The content of the two is the same. All right, so if that's what a proposition is, what is truth? Good question. And philosophers do get slightly tangled up in all of this. What I want to do is just use a very, very rough and ready simple account, because I think First of all, that's the account that tended to be used by the people that I'm interested in who put together these puzzles, and also because actually I think it's got a lot to be said for it. So one way to put it is P is true if and only if P, where P is a proposition. Okay. Now, that's not very helpful. Let me give you an example. Here's a proposition: the cat is on the mat. That proposition is true only if and only if, that's that if with two F's. That's a kind of philosophical if that means if and only if. The cat is on the mat is true if and only if the cat is on the mat. So notice that one of the things there is a proposition. That's the one designated in the quotation marks. The proposition, the cat is on the mat, that's true only when the cat is on the mat over there. Okay, so truth in this case is to do with the relationship between the content of a proposition, what the proposition says about the world, and the way the world is. And if what the proposition says about the world corresponds to how the world is, then that proposition is true. But if how the proposition describes the world does not correspond to how the world is, then the proposition is false. So if the cat is not on the mat, then that proposition is false. Whereas if the cat is on the mat, it's true. So sometimes this is called a correspondence theory of truth. And that's a nice way of kind of understanding it. So the idea is that truth, the proposition is true if it corresponds with the bit of the world it's talking about. So the proposition, it is raining, is true if and only if there is rain falling where I am right now, and so on. Again, that's kind of making, you might think it's making a mountain out of a molehill, a metaphor that will be relevant in a moment in another respect. But just let's get sort of, this is the kind of thing philosophers do. They take something that seems very straightforward and then they make a lot of fuss about it. But there we go. So a proposition is true if and only if it corresponds with how the world is. So let's go back to my claim that every proposition is either true or false. And again, let's abbreviate to use P to stand for a proposition. That amounts to, for all P, either P is true or P is false, right? So for every proposition that you can come up with, that proposition has to be either true or false. And this has a kind of fancy name, if you like. In fact, there are three subtly different fancy names for this kind of idea. But this is the kind of how you might put it. One way to put it is that what I've just given you is what's called the principle of bivalence. Bi meaning two, valence meaning value. So every proposition has just one truth value, where the truth value is it's either true or false. True and false are the truth values. There are only two of them, hence bivalence. Every proposition has just one of those, and it has exactly one of those. Another way of saying that is there's nothing that true and false are exclusive possibilities. Nothing can be both, and they're exhaustive possibilities. As it were, the proposition has to be one or the other. There's no third possibility. There are other ways that philosophers sometimes talk about it. There's a version, a related principle called the principle of the excluded middle that either says that says either P is the case or the negation of P is the case. And you can see there's a, if you really want to kind of impress the world, you can use this bit of fancy notation where that means or, and that's the negation sign, where that just means P or not P. Either it's raining or it's not raining. Or, which means that if P is not true, then not P is, and if P is true, then not P is false. Or the principle of non-contradiction, It's not the case that P and not P. It's not possible for both P and not P to be true. Right. Don't worry too much about these distinctions. All I want us to kind of have on the table right now is the basic idea that for all of those propositions that we were looking at, things like a trillion is a big number, it's raining, Cambridge will win the league, I had Weetabix for breakfast, all of those propositions must have one and only one of these truth values. All of them must either be true or be false. And we've got some idea about what determines which of those truth values they have, this kind of notion of correspondence or failure to correspond. Now you might be thinking, this sounds very dumb. Is it at all useful? Well, yes, and you do it intuitively, and you're relying often on these principles, whether you recognize that that's what you're doing or not. So remember that we said the proposition and its negation, P and not P, it's raining and it's not the case that it's raining, are exclusive and exhaustive. That means they can't both be true, and one or other of them must be true. So we can infer something about not P if we know the value of P and vice versa. So let's imagine the idea, let's take as a proposition, everyone here loves Marmite. Okay. Now, if we can determine that that's false, it generates for us a truth. Okay. So if we know that that is false, what truth do you think it generates? Go on, quick type into the chat and let's see how quickly you get it. Good. Not everyone here loves Marmite, right? Just the negation of that proposition. It doesn't show you that nobody loves Marmite. It just shows you that it's not the case that everyone loves Marmite. And that's perfectly compatible, of course, with most people loving Marmite. In fact, everybody apart from one, maybe, not loving Marmite. So this is a very, very kind of basic and simple kind of form of inference. If you know that a proposition is true, you can also know that its negation is false. If you know that a proposition is false, you know that its negation is true, and so on. You probably don't think about it like that, but that's exactly how it works. So if someone says, I didn't steal your wallet, and you know that that is false, the truth you discover is that they did steal your wallet, for example. Okay, so I've taken a while to set that up, but for the remainder, what I want to do is look at three problems that seem to arise on the basis of that framework. That framework seems so obvious and clear and almost so transparent that it hardly needs saying. But there are problems with these principles. And it's the kind of problems that my Greek friends, my ancient Greek friends, really loved to muck about with. And they did it mostly to show off. They did it mostly so that they could get people to say things that were absurd so they could laugh at them. But regardless of that kind of intention, I think they show some underlying deep and interesting philosophical puzzles. Okay, what about the following case? Now, you may already have guessed what the next case is going to be, given our friend in the corner. What about if the proposition is this? What I am now saying is false. Now, those principles that we've been talking about suggest that that proposition has a truth value, that it has one of only two possible truth values. Either that proposition P is true, or that proposition P is false. But there's a difficulty here, because it seems that whichever of those two we think it has, it implies it also has the other, and vice versa. So, for example, if it's true, that proposition, if P is true, given that P's truth corresponds to some fact about the world, then if it's true, then what it says, if you like, is true. Namely, what I'm saying is false. But if it's true that what I'm saying is false, then how can the proposition be true? And so on. So if the proposition is false, then what I'm saying is in fact false. So it does correspond to how the world is. But if it corresponds to how the world is, then the proposition is true. And so the general principle seems to be that any kind of this particular kind of proposition leads us into what seems to be a kind of infinite feedback loop. Whichever truth value you start off assuming it has, then it necessarily has the other. And if it has the other, it necessarily has the first one, and round you go. So which of those truth values does P have? It seems it can't have either, and it can't have both. So it looks like a counterexample to that really helpful principle that we began with earlier on, that principle of bivalence. This looks like a very, very straightforward proposition that immediately throws a spanner in the works of any such kind of claim. Now, why does it do that? What is the particular fact, what is the particular nature of this kind of proposition that causes a difficulty of that kind? Well, diagnoses differ, but roughly speaking, I think, there are two factors that are combining to cause this difficulty. The first factor is that the content of the proposition includes saying something about its truth value. So the content itself of the proposition makes reference to falsehood in this case. So compare the cat is on the mat as a proposition. That doesn't include any reference to falsehood or truth in it. And second, this proposition is what's called self-referential or self-indexical or versions like that, because it's talking about itself. And propositions that talk about themselves often cause difficulties when we're determining their truth value or not. Because one way to put it is, well, in the case of the proposition, the cat is on the mat, it's pretty clear what it was that would correspond out in the world, if you like, to that proposition that would be its truth maker. The thing that makes that proposition true is something out in the world. It's the cat and whether it's sitting on the mat or not. But in this case, it seems that the truth maker of this proposition is the proposition itself. It's what it's saying is saying something about itself. And that's why you tend to get this kind of feedback loop going on, where instead of its truth value being fixed by something external to it, instead, its truth value seems to be fixed by its own self. And what's more, throw in the idea that it's denying its own truth, and you end up with all of these difficulties. So I'll leave you with that for the moment and move on to a second case. But I think in many ways, this is one of the most puzzling of those cases. Saying quite why it's difficult is quite a challenge. So here's the second problem. The proposition I want now to worry about is this one. This seems to be not such a problem because it doesn't have either of the factors that caused a problem previously. That is to say, It's not a self-referential, it's not a proposition that talks about itself, nor is it a proposition that, as it were, states something about its own truth value. One grain of sand is not a heap. Okay, that looks just like the cat is on the mat, for example, that its truth would be determined by something external to it, some fact about sands and some fact about heaps. So let's agree that that proposition is true. It seems pretty plausible that if I have just a single grain of sand, it would be a bit perverse to say that I have a heap of sand. Right? It's just one grain, and surely one grain can't count as a heap. All right. So P here, the proposition P, looks pretty plausible in the sense that I think most people would agree that it's true. It would be quite hard to show that it's false in any way. Now let's add another thought. What I'm going to do now is construct an argument. And to construct an argument, you need more than one proposition. So my first proposition is P, one grain of sand is not a heap. And here's my second proposition. I'm going to call this Q. And that proposition is, well, if I have something that's not a heap, and I add one grain of sand to it, then the resulting sum is also not a heap. Okay. The idea here is, here's my not a heap. I've got one grain of sand in my hand. If I take another single grain of sand and add it, that's not going to turn it into a heap. One grain of sand doesn't make the difference between something being a heap and something being not. And that seems plausible too. If you don't think that's plausible, then I could even say, well, if I have something that's not a heap and I add a squintillionth of a grain of sand to it, that's not going to make it a heap. Doesn't matter. All I've got here is the premise that a tiny addition to something that's not a heap will not result in a heap by the addition of that tiny amount. So I think it's pretty plausible that P is true, and also it's plausible that Q is true. But now here's the problem. If P and Q are both true, then it looks like we're going to have a problem. It looks like this thing here, we've got good reasons to think it is a heap and good reasons to think it's not a heap. Okay. Why? Well, because if P and Q are true, then the combination of them will eventually lead to the claim that however many grain of sands I have, I'm not going to have a heap. So let me start again with my one grain of sand here. We agreed that that's not a heap, and we agreed that if I add a single grain of sand to it, that's not a heap either. But now again, then, what I have in my hand is not a heap of sand. And if I add one grain of sand to it, we agreed, didn't we, that adding a grain of sand to something that's not a heap of sand doesn't produce a heap. So I hope you can see how, provided I add the grains of sand just one at a time, and provided that we agree that what I start with is not a heap, and we agree that adding a single grain of sand to something that's not a heap produces something else that's not a heap, then however many grains of sand I add, one by one, I'm never going to generate a heap. So I could end up with something like this, something so big I can't even hold it in my hand anymore, and that's not a heap, because those other propositions are true. Now, so far, this isn't a problem for the principles that I set out before. It's just an argument that seems valid, but seems to have a false conclusion. If those principles are both true, then this does seem to be the result, but the result seems to be absurd. But here's another version of it. So now let's, as it were, start from the opposite end. My starting proposition here is, let's call this R, that 1 trillion grains of sand make a heap. If you don't agree with that, then I will just keep adding to the number until I come up with an amount of sand that is a heap. Okay, then my next one is, if I have something that is a heap and I take away one grain, then what is left is also a heap. So if you imagine that picture that we had before, a huge pile of sand, that's a heap. If I just were to take away one grain of sand, that wouldn't, the resulting amount would still be a heap. Well, you can see how this is going to work as well. If those are both true, then every collection of grains is a heap, and even a single grain is a heap, because provided from my starting heap, I only take one grain of sand away at a time, and we agree that taking away one grain of sand from a heap doesn't produce something that's not a heap, then it seems I can do as many of those subtractions as I like, and I'm always going to have a heap behind. So we can go in two directions. We can show that even a very large number of grains of sand is not a heap, if we start with something that's not a heap and add sand one at a time. And we've said that if you start with a heap and take grains of sand one away at a time, that's always going to be a heap. So it seems that we've ended up with good reasons to believe something like the following: that for any given number of grain of sands, n, we have a good argument to show that n grains of sand is a heap is both true and false. If you said to me, well, 10 million grains of sand is a heap, I will just do the, as it were, adding argument to you, the conclusion of which is that it's not. If you tell me that 10 grains of sand is not a heap, I will do the subtraction version, from which, if you agree with the premises, you have to agree that it is a heap. So both n grains of sand is heap and n grains of sand is not a heap, where n is the same number. They're both true. That seems to violate one of our principles before. So this is what these Greek philosophers were interested in. It's called a Sorites argument, S-O-R-I-T-E-S, and that's just, the word there is just a word from the Greek word for a heap, the heapiness argument, if you like. So they were really interested in how two premises that both seem plausible and true can generate these kinds of absurd results. And what's more, you can generate, as it were, arguments that go in opposite directions to show that for any number in that range, you've got a good reason for believing both that it's true that it's a heap and that it's false that it's a heap. And that seems to be a problem, because then whatever number you assign to n, it looks like it's breaking all of those principles. But it's not breaking them, because it's the kind of funky proposition that what I'm now saying is lying turns out to be, namely a kind of proposition that talks about itself and also talks about its own truth value. This seems like a perfectly common or garden kind of proposition. Now, there are other examples of things that can generate these kinds of problems. So things like Bob is bald. Well, if someone is bald but sprouts the tiniest whisper of a hair, surely that person remains bald, because the addition of the tiniest amount of hair doesn't make someone bald, someone no longer bald, and so on. And so you can see how that would go, that eventually you can claim that someone with however many hairs on their head as you like is also bald, or 1 trillion is a large number, or so-and-so is old. You don't suddenly turn from being not old to being old overnight or in a second or so on. So if you start off not being old, you're not going to be old 1 second from then. And if you're not old then, Another second isn't going to make you old. And so you can never become old. Now, as one of the comments in the Q&A has just suggested, maybe what's wrong here is something about the meaning of some of these terms. Large, small, bald, heap, and so on. So sometimes it's termed that they're kind of vague. And what that means is there are cases that everyone would agree to. So there are cases where everyone would agree this is a heap, cases where everyone would agree this is not a heap, cases where everyone would say that's large, or cases where everyone would agree it's not large. But there are these, as it were, middling cases where it's just not clear anymore, where in the range in question, it's hard to see when something, as it were, going downwards stops being large and becomes not large, or going in the opposite direction stops being not large and becoming large. So it's something to do with these terms that generate these problems. Terms like a heap, terms like large or bald or small or old and so on. So that's the kind of problem that suggests that it's not necessarily a linguistic problem. It's a question about these kinds of properties, the properties of largeness or baldness or heap, being a heap and so on. That might be what's going on here. Okay. So let me now turn to the third of my problems. So the third of the problems is the idea that there's something that there's something that there's a problem, sorry, that emerges with a certain kind of proposition, namely propositions that are future tensed. Okay, so if you remember, when we saw those initial group of propositions, they included things like it is raining, but also I had Weetabix for breakfast and Cambridge will win the league. Those all seem to be perfectly standard kinds of proposition, and therefore it seems that those principles of truth and falsehood seem to apply. Well, here's a problem that takes those principles and shows that if they apply, then a crazy result may turn out. So it's a kind of argument to an absurdity. So here's how that goes. Here's a new claim. My next toss of this coin will land heads. Okay, so imagine here's Joe, and he's saying that, and he's saying my next toss of this coin will land heads. Well, given those principles that we set out at the very beginning, then that proposition, like every other, must be true or false. So it can't be the case both that it will land heads and that it will not land heads. It can't be the case that both the proposition and its negation are true. One of them must be true and one of them must be false. And they can't be both. Okay, so P cannot be true and false, and P cannot be neither true nor false. It has to have one and only one of those truth values. Okay, so much so boring. But here's the problem. We know that that proposition must be one or the other. It must be true or it must be false. But here's where the difficulty lies. If that proposition is true, if the proposition my next toss of the coin will land heads is true, then the coin must land heads, right? What kind of must is that? Well, it's simply the case that it can't be the case that the proposition is true and the coin doesn't land heads, because the proposition as being true requires that the coin will land heads. That's, as it were, that correspondence that we talked about earlier on. So if the proposition is true, then the coin will necessarily land heads. But the other possibility is that that proposition is false. But then this seems to be the case. If that proposition is false, then the coin cannot land heads. Why not? Well, it can't be the case both that the proposition is false and that the coin does land heads. Okay. That's just the kind of mirror image of what A said. That the propositions being false is just incompatible with the coin landing heads. That can't be the case. Okay. So either way, we have a surprising result, and as a pair, they generate a surprising result. So some of my ancient guys argued that this logical principle of truth and falsehood generates a problem that they thought was a kind of determinism. Because it turns out, given that the proposition must be either true or false, and given that if it's true, then the coin must land heads, but if it's false, then the coin cannot land heads, so too, it turns out that the coin either must or cannot land heads. And that sounds wrong, because it seems that either way the outcome is fixed. Either it's necessary for the coin to land heads, if the proposition is true, or it's impossible for the coin to land heads because the proposition is false. And that sounds wrong, because surely what we want to say, as Joe is tossing the coin in the air, is that it's possible for it to land heads, but not necessary. So by possible, obviously, we mean not impossible, but by possible, I also mean not necessary. Okay. What we want to say is roughly that as he flicks the coin up in the air, it might turn out heads and it might turn out tails. Let's just, for the moment, agree that it won't sort of just stick in the Lloyd's turf up on its side. Let's just agree that coins fall one way or another. But what we want to say is the outcome isn't fixed. It's a contingent matter. It may turn out to land heads. It may turn out to land tails. But that doesn't seem to be what our argument showed. And it seemed to be that when Joe says, my next coin toss will land heads, at the time he's saying it, what he's saying has to be either true or false. Just as when I say now Cambridge will win the league, right now, what I'm saying has one of those truth values. It can't have both, it must have one. So I must be either now uttering a truth or else now uttering a falsehood. But either one seems to suggest that the outcome is already determined. If what I'm saying is true, then Cambridge must win the league. If what I'm saying is false, then Cambridge can't win the league. But that doesn't sound right, because right now we want to say that Cambridge might, but might not win the league. But this principle of bivalence has thrown another problem in the way of what seems to be common sense. So what's gone wrong? Well, just to be clear, it's not going to help to say, well, we just don't know whether that proposition is true or false. That is true. It's true that we might not know right now whether it's true or whether it's false. But it doesn't matter. That's just a question of our knowledge, not relevant to this case. And that's not relevant because we've shown that this strange result happens either way. Either that proposition is true or it's false. And it doesn't matter that I don't know which of them it is, because I've given you an argument that shows that if it so happens that it's true, then the coin has to land heads. Whereas if it so happens that it's false, then the coin cannot land heads. Okay. And given that it's either true or false, then it seems like the two options are either it must or it cannot land heads. And that doesn't seem right. It seems to suggest that the outcome is fixed either way. Now, you might say something like the following, and this is something that some reasonable philosophers, including, for example, Aristotle, said. Aristotle seemed to think that what we should say here is that these kinds of propositions are an exception to that principle of bivalence. That there are some propositions that even at the time we utter them, they're neither true nor false. Their truth value is undecided. It's not just that we don't know what their truth value is, it's that their truth value genuinely is undecided. It's neither true nor false yet. And maybe the truth value is only resolved once the thing in the future that it's talking about does or doesn't happen. But that sounds like an odd thing to say. Because really what we should say is, when I say today in my next toss of this coin will land heads, then I'm today saying something either true or false, right? So just think, when the weather presenter says this evening, tomorrow it will rain in central London, we would reasonably suggest that that prediction has a truth value, right? It's true now, what they're saying, or it's false now, what they're saying. And so, given that it already has a truth value, if you like, then the problem seems to recur. If it's true when the weather presenter says it will rain in central London tomorrow, then it has to rain in central London tomorrow. If what they're saying is false, then it can't possibly rain in central London tomorrow. So how do we diagnose this problem? Well, let's take the cat on the mat again. There, the version of this in the future tense is the cat will sit on the mat is true if and only if the cat will sit on the mat, right? That's just me substituting the future for the present. So the formula we saw earlier on was that the cat is on the mat is true if and only if the cat is on the mat. And it seems to me that what we should say is something like this, that just as previously we said what makes that proposition true is the cat sitting on the mat. The cat sitting on the mat is what makes the proposition the cat sits on the mat true. So too, we should say exactly the same thing in this case. That what makes the proposition the cat will sit on the mat true is the cat's future sitting on the mat. It's true now because the cat will indeed sit on the mat, right? And it's that way around. It's not, as in the coin toss problem, that the truth of the proposition is what makes the cat sit on the mat. Rather, just as in the basic correspondence case, it's the cat sitting on the mat that makes the proposition true. So too, it's the cat sitting on the mat in the future that makes it true now when I say the cat will sit on the mat. Now, you might think that sounds a bit weird, that something in the future is making something the case in the present. Isn't that a kind of funny kind of backwards causation or something weird like that? But the kind of thing it's making is a very, very special kind of making. Making a proposition true isn't like, some kind of Doctor Who time paradox. It's not actually altering how the world is. It's just the fact that it's showing that this thing that I say now is true because it corresponds to the bit of the world it's talking about. And it just so happens that the bit of the world it's talking about is something temporally in the future. So I think that's probably the best way out of the coin toss problem. And if you do that, then it's not, the truth value that's determining the outcome. Rather, it's the outcome when it happens that makes it true or false now. So what I hope I've done, and you may not find all three of these problems equally a problem. You might not find all of them equally interesting. You might not, in fact, think any of them are particularly perplexing. But what I've tried to do is give you an example of the kind of philosophy that begins with some very, very straightforward sorts of thoughts, but developing them, taking them into unusual cases or specific kinds of applications, and testing out those principles. That's where real philosophy happens. That's where things occur that are strange or odd or interesting. And that's what I find fun about doing philosophy. So thank you very much. I think there were some Q&A, there were some questions that popped up as I went along. I think I answered most of them. I think
so I can field some for you, James,
okay,
to save you looking through the chat, so you can concentrate on giving the answers. So Alec would like to know: are there any philosophical works, that focus in on the types of problem presented in problem 3?
Oh, on problem 3, that one. Now I'd have to. I mean, what I would suggest, anyone interested in any of this sort of stuff, there's a tremendous online resource that maybe you mentioned before, called the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy online. And, browsing any of the articles you come across on there will lead you down all sorts of interesting rabbit holes and kinds of trains of thought. So I think what you want to look at is an article on logical determinism. And I think that would give you some of the thoughts on this kind of thing. The other really interesting book that I would suggest is, here are two, and perhaps I can, I'm not sure I can post in the chat, but one is a book just called Paradoxes by R.M. Sainsbury, which goes through these and various other paradoxes. Very interesting. And the other is a book, and the joking title doesn't work if I read it out. But it's called "There Are Two Mistakes in the title of this book." Right? Now, the point being, it's obvious that one mistake in the title of the book is that the word "the" is repeated. But then the second mistake is that it says there are two mistakes, whereas in fact there's only one. So it's one of these kind of self-referential things where if there's only one mistake, then there are two mistakes. But if there are two mistakes, there's in fact only one mistake. So yeah, you've got the link to that title there. So if these are the kind of puzzles and questions that you get interested in, those are two books that I would encourage you, three resources, two books that I encourage you to kind of just dip into and see. I mean, with a lot of this, it's not the case that the thing to do is start at page 1 and plow through until you get to the very end. Holding on for grim death. The idea is to kind of just dip in, see what floats your boat, what you find enjoyable, and follow your nose.
We've got, I think they're two related questions, which I'm going to put together. So Emily and William want to know, on the one hand, what are your thoughts about the coherence theory of truth? Mm-hmm. And then on the other hand, what are your thoughts on the deflationary theory of truth?
Okay, now I'm going to have to dig back into some kind of recesses of my mind on these theories of truth. As far as the coherence theory of truth, as far as I understand it, that says that truth is a property of a proposition insofar as it coheres with other propositions. Right? So it's to do with that kind of relationship between propositions. So groups of propositions that are maximally coherent are true. The problem with that, I think, is it just doesn't give any way of making good on the reasonable intuition that we have, which is that whether what I say is true or not has something to do with how the world is. I mean, that I'm, as it were, trying to say something about the world rather than just trying to say something that fits with other things that I think or say. So that's my worry about coherence. Deflationist, I think what I have to say is reasonably consistent with deflationist theory of truth, if I understand that right. I mean, what I think that means is that the propositions being true or not is not, as it were, an additional property of the proposition. It just is the property standing in a certain relationship to some fact about the world, right? So it doesn't acquire a brand new property just by doing so. When we say it's true, all we mean is that it stands in that sort of a relationship. That's what I think deflationary means, but I may be out of date.
Andrea would like to know, can any version of truth have intrinsic value that would not be dependent on its relation to the outside world?
Wow. Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, what we didn't talk about were truths that don't, as it were, seem to point outside themselves to some fact about the world at all, or sort of it's not clear what fact about the world they're pointing to. So what I have in mind there are kind of mathematical truths or those kinds of things. I mean, if 2 + 2 = 4 is a truth, if that statement is true, is it about anything? Is there some fact in the world that it's about? I'm not sure. If it isn't about some fact in the world, some fact of the matter in the world, it still seems that it's valuable to know things like 2 + 2 = 4, in which case you might say, that's an argument for that having some kind of value. Intrinsic value, well, I suppose what you might mean by that is it good to have and say things that are true, regardless of whether they allow you to accomplish anything, right? So, and it seems, I think so. I mean, it seems to me, I would rather that my beliefs and my thoughts be true than false, just because I think that's a good thing. I mean, regardless of whether that allows me to do things that I might not otherwise do. It's just, when I'm deciding what to believe, I want to believe things that are true, not things that are false.
I'm conscious that we've overrun by 10 minutes. So I think that was a nice sentiment to finish on. It is nice to think that what you think is true and not false. Right. So I'd say on behalf of everyone, James, thank you very much for your time and answering questions. Very interesting.